everyone. I'd like to begin by welcoming you to the last and what I've heard is a really successful series, the MacEachen Institute Policy Matters panel series. It's been taking place over the last 10 weeks. Today we're here to talk about the topic, Not All Fun and Games, Difficult Decisions and Trade-offs in Cultural and Recreational Infrastructure. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. My name is Karen Gallant. I'm a faculty member in Recreation and Leisure Studies in the School of Health and Human Performance, which is in the Faculty of Health, and I was really pleased to be here today to chair this discussion, kind of coming in at the last minute today. And in Recreation and Leisure Studies, we have both undergraduate and graduate programs in recreation, and we have some of our own grad students here today, so I'll give a little call out to them and to other colleagues in Recreation and Leisure Studies who've joined us today for the discussion. The decision to invest in cultural and recreational infrastructure, community centers, museums, music halls, swimming pools, and ice rinks, for example, can help further important social, cultural, environmental, economic, and health goals for the province. In my own field of recreation and leisure studies, we talk about culture and recreational experiences as being those activities that people do when they're able to exercise choice and freedom. In other words, the things that people love. So while we're speaking of infrastructure that advances social, cultural, and other goals, we're also speaking of places that often hold a special place in people's lives, as places where they can do what they love, share and develop aspects of themselves that are important to them, and feel like they belong to a community. Thus, while there's a strong rationale for investing in such spaces, there are limits to funding and capacity. As different orders of government are set to allocate funds for cultural and recreational infrastructure in the coming years, decision makers must make difficult decisions that reconcile important but sometimes competing priorities, such as social and environmental concerns on the one hand and financial and economic on the other. This panel will report on new research that examines the policy context for decision-making related to cultural and recreational infrastructure in Nova Scotia and governance frameworks that can assist with difficult decisions and make values and trade-offs more explicit. So today's panel, we have 4 speakers, and I'll introduce them as they come up. So, but we have Kevin Quigley, Bill Greenlaw, Åsa Kachan, and Gil Dares, kind of going along here. Kevin's claimed 20 minutes for his presentation today because he's presenting a new report, and the other speakers will each have 10 minutes. So I'll ask each of them to come up and turn, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions at the end of the session. So Kevin Quigley, our first speaker, is the scholarly director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance and a professor in Dalhousie School of Public Administration in the Faculty of Management. He specializes in public sector risk and crisis management, strategic management, and critical infrastructure protection. He's published an acclaimed book on critical infrastructure, numerous articles in academic journals, and studies for a professional audience. His newest book, Too Critical to Fail, How Canada Manages Threats to Critical Infrastructure, was published by McGill Queen's in November 2017 and shortlisted for the Donner Prize. So now I'll invite Kevin to come on up.
Thank you, Karen. Pleasure to be here and presenting some of this new research that was commissioned by ACOA in the province. And I want to thank them for the support they provided during the process, though we take full responsibility and all the blame for the work that we did. Okay, but thanks to ACOA and for the province for supporting the work. I also want to thank Paul Beasley and Caitlin Lowe. Caitlin, who's here to my left. There's two recent MPA graduates, so for those of you who are in the MPA program who are in the class, recognize that this work was largely put together by graduate students who have now graduated and are doing and do other things in public policy research. So thanks to Caitlin, thanks to Paul for a job extremely well done. I was thinking about this over the weekend about how I wanted to start this conversation, and I thought I'll start with a reference to some things that are in the news without necessarily getting into the specifics, because I don't want this to become an extended lecture about any of these photos in particular, because I'm sure we could spend a lot of time talking about all of them. But I think that for me, what is particularly interesting is thinking about sports, arts, recreation, And actually the number of issues that are in the news on these topics right now, whether it's a possible CFL stadium, soccer downtown Halifax, and a sort of pop-up stadium, the issue of Coach's Corner and Don Cherry and Ron McLean, new art gallery for Nova Scotia, and then the flooding in Venice that has occurred recently. Actually, two times in a very dramatic way in the last 10 days or so. To me, it kind of resonates in the sense that it shows as one how topical the question of sports is, and that it can ignite intense debates. I think I would emphasize that all of these stories are happening in a social, cultural, economic, environmental, and demographic context that influences the way we see these debates. And I think I would also say to you that if I put this slide up 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you would react differently to it, or those of us who would be here 30 years ago, or if it was a different audience, a different group of MPA students, we would see these visuals and we would ask questions about football stadiums and coaches' corners and soccer downtown Halifax, and we would react to it differently. So this is important, I think, that one, it happens in a context, and two, that context changes over time. So going back to my own youth, I will flag for those baseball fans here that I was in the Sky Dome in 1993 when the big home run was hit at the bottom of the ninth and the Blue Jays won the World Series for the second time. It was a very exciting moment. Still waiting for the Leafs to win the Stanley Cup, but that was the sports highlight for me of my career, to be in that stadium on that night. But I will point out to those of you who are sports fans that the Blue Jays averaged 50,000 people a game that season. 50,000 people, not in the playoffs, 50,000 each and every game. They averaged 50,000 people in 1992 and 1993. A couple of years later, a team named the Raptors popped up, and the marketing executives said at the time that the older crowd in Toronto was so hostile to the concept of basketball that they effectively were a lost cause, and they were not going to market to them. They were going to market to younger people with a medium-term strategy of building up a fan base over time. So we know how that story has turned around now about our engagement with basketball, and I'll say that the Blue Jays averaged 20,000 people a year at their games this year. It does remind me about some of the work that we did, though, in this study around cultural recreational infrastructure. One of the anecdotes that came out of Winnipeg, for example, was the changing demand for infrastructure, and that in fact in Winnipeg there was increased demand for cricket grounds over baseball diamonds, and so they were converting some of these baseball diamonds into cricket grounds because of course of the large aging population that was in Winnipeg, and how they want to spend their time and their skills and their interests. Coming a little closer to home and thinking about some of my own personal experiences here in Halifax, I'm also, I guess I would frame the discussion a little bit by touching the story of the Canada Game Centre. When I first started taking my daughters to swimming lessons, it was a much smaller swimming rink, or swimming pool not far from the Canada Game Centre. I think it was called Northwood, but I can't really remember. Northcliffe? It was Northcliffe. Okay, so for those of you who know Northcliffe, it was a freezing pool and a very, very tiny facility. But after the swimming lesson was over, I'd grab my daughter and we'd wait in line to use a family change room because there were only 3 at that particular center. So it would take a long time, and it was freezing, and the kids were screaming. Maybe at the time having change rooms for families was progressive whenever Northcliffe was built. I don't know when it was built. Maybe at the time it seemed progressive. But it was an interesting contrast when the Canada Game Centre opened. And there was a huge family change facility. And I thought what a powerful comment that was about the demand, but also who was using it, why they were using it, how they were using it, and how fabulous it was for our family that we could go to the Canada Game Centre and we could go through, mostly without incident, through those family change room and get into the pool much more quickly. It was so much slower before. And sort of, for me, it touched a point about how the architecture and the design of these buildings reflects changing values, expectations, et cetera. And we see that throughout cultural recreational infrastructure. Today, there's much more sensitivity around accessibility issues, for example, and I would say also with Dowplex's most recent additions around gender-neutral change facilities, et cetera, to be much more accommodating and welcoming for different groups, different audiences, meeting different expectations. And so I return to this point that, one, culture and recreation exists in a particular context, and that context changes over time. The problem with cultural and recreational infrastructure, though, is it takes time to plan, build, and pay for, and it's with you for a very, very long time. So part of it, this is art and science trying to develop cultural and recreational infrastructure, because we have to be aware of the context, and we also have to think about how it might change and how do we build sort of adaptive capacity into it. So with that in mind, we had a challenge to examine governance frameworks for cultural and recreational infrastructure. And the focus of the report that we've issued and is now online, and it looks like that document to the left, the focus is largely on small communities. So although my examples are urban up front, the report largely focuses on smaller communities in rural Nova Scotia. And we wanted to make some recommendations about how to think about cultural recreational infrastructure and how one might reconcile some of the tough decisions and trade-offs that have to be thought of when building some of this cultural recreational infrastructure. So what did we do? We explored aspects of social, cultural, and economic, we explored aspects of the social and economic context in Nova Scotia, particularly smaller communities. We summarized existing government programs in CRI, and we reviewed frameworks that could help officials make decisions about which projects to support. It was a desktop literature review, so there was no primary research involved. It happened in the winter between January and March. We reviewed 32 frameworks in our research. We looked at a number of jurisdictions across the country and across the Western world, actually. In fact, and also around the world, when I think about it, a lot of different reports, because a lot of countries and jurisdictions are struggling with this question of how do we make decisions around cultural recreational infrastructure? What do we build? How do we build it? You know, for what purpose? How do we maintain it? A question that gets asked a lot less frequently, though, is how do we retire it? Or how do we repurpose it? We tend to have an emphasis on building bigger and bigger and more, but not so much concerned about repurposing and retiring, which is a significant challenge we should think about going forward. I will point out the report, while it focuses largely on smaller communities and rural communities, there are references to Indigenous communities in the report, but the report is not specifically around Indigenous communities. So if one were to approach questions of Indigenous governance, I think it would be a bigger project and really outside of the scope of what we tried to accomplish with this specific report. That said, there are references to Indigenous communities and some specific points to consider, but not really the primary focus, which is probably require a reflection on a much larger number of contextual issues, I would say. So what did we find in this? In sum, we need better information to make these decisions. Like a lot of jurisdictions, by the way, it's very hard to get the data to make informed decisions on this stuff. We need better tools to make decisions, and we also need trusted processes so that people can have confidence when they submit proposals. If they're accepted or rejected, they have confidence in that process. I'm going to touch just very quickly on the social economic context that we studied for the report. There's lots of information in the report which is on our website and available for you to review. But when we look at the social, cultural, economic context in rural Nova Scotia, there are a number of challenges that the communities are facing, partly because of increased urbanization, the draw from bigger cities. Some rural communities are struggling with aging population, youth out-migration, historically stagnant immigration, limited revenue options, other pressing financial priorities, low and precarious employment, and high rates of chronic health issues. So this is the social, economic, cultural context, part of it anyway, that some parts of rural Nova Scotia are struggling with. Not all parts. There's a lot of diversity in the experiences in rural Nova Scotia, but in some parts these are indeed some significant challenges. And so when you're thinking about cultural recreational infrastructure, these contextual issues have to be taken into account when you're making decisions. So I want to talk a little bit about what we did with these 32 frameworks. So it was a lot, and they all had stories to tell about how to build gyms and theaters and museums, et cetera, but we saw there were 4 trends. So rather than I stand up here and tell you this is what they're doing in Australia, this is what they're doing in New Zealand, the OECD, the UK, the US, et cetera, I'm going to talk about 4 overarching trends. And again, in the report, there's tons of information, tons of examples to support all this stuff. But there are 4 types of frameworks that could guide our decision. One is a command framework, one's a community framework, one's a consumer framework, and one is a coping framework. A command framework is a sort of bureaucratic framework. It's largely focused on rules, regulations, process, top-down decision-making. Ultimately, the accountability resides at the top. So it's largely a bureaucratic model of how we would think about governance and decision-making. A community framework, I think my bullet points dropped a little bit lower on the right, but a community framework is about community engagement. So the emphasis is on community and process. So we're talking about town hall meetings, we're talking about roundtables, we're talking about making an inclusive process, and we're talking about consensus-seeking agreements, I guess, in the community. When we think about consumer frameworks, we're talking about treating the cultural recreational infrastructure more like a business, right? This is where you think about the user as a customer. There's more emphasis on user fees, performance data, competition if possible, also the language of business as well. Sometimes the heads of these organizations are referred to as CEOs. Sometimes they have contract relationships with the government. Sometimes there's a certain amount of outsourcing, public-private partnerships, things that bring market pressures to bear on the way that cultural recreational infrastructure is built and maintained. So I would emphasize that in this particular case, when we're talking about consumer, a kind of consumer model, there is sort of an emphasis on running the infrastructure more like a business, although it's not a business, okay? But it's drawing from probably a transactional way to think about this kind of activity. It's drawing best practices from businesses, and it's using that. I'll just maybe pause on this one for a second and just say that in Britain, for example, which is very, very, they're drawn to consumer models in the UK. They would often also ask like business leaders to sit on their boards to give oversight to, say, galleries and things like that, because they feel like there's a lot of value in bringing private sector thinking into the public sector. So for those of you who are familiar with the sort of concepts of new public management, for instance, that would be in the bottom left-hand corner when we think about consumer, okay? So you've got one focus that's very community-oriented, one that's very consumer-oriented. And the final one is a coping framework. And when we talk about a coping framework, we're talking about a framework where there's a high level of uncertainty, a high level of fragmentation, essentially low trust, and we're looking at a context in which the community probably is feeling a little bit despondent. They have to adapt depending on what the circumstances are. So the focus tends to be on resilience and adaptive capacity, as opposed to a more sort of stable framework. So, you know, demand for their infrastructure might change, or the project may be approved, or it may not be. There's a sort of undercurrent of uncertainty that would underpin a coping framework. Okay, so again, command is largely bureaucratic, community very community-focused, consumer very market-oriented, and a coping one is largely about what we'd call a fatalist sort of model, which is about resilience, I suppose, and adaptive capacity. We'll say that each of these frameworks, this is rooted in the work of Mary Douglas, who's an anthropologist, who talks about these 4 types of governance. It's a very useful framework, I think. I use it quite a bit in the work that I do. What I would emphasize is all of these frameworks have strengths and weaknesses. There is no perfect model, no perfect way to make decisions, and there isn't one framework that fits perfectly into these 4 boxes. It says more about the tendency of the framework. Does the framework tend towards a bureaucratic approach? Does it put more emphasis on community? Does it put more emphasis on customer? Does it put more emphasis on adaptive capacity? Okay, so they're the tendencies, and through those tendencies we can think about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these models. Plenty to read about in the report. I'm not going to say too much more about that, but that was the theoretical framework we used to examine these forms of governance. I do think it's very useful because it gives you a sort of shorthand of the strengths and weaknesses of thinking about different approaches to cultural recreational infrastructure. There's a lot of emphasis on community in a lot of these frameworks, but communities also have their limitations in terms of like lots of community engagement, but how do you make decisions? Can you really take radical options when you're in a consensus-seeking environment, et cetera? Okay, so what did we recommend at the end of this? We recommended a command framework, and this is largely because these decisions are made in a bureaucratic context. So it's important that the framework aligns with the organizations that are using it. But the second thing is a command framework is in some respects more adaptive than the other kinds of frameworks, because a bureaucratic framework or a command framework can just build in criteria from the other types. So if you're a bureaucracy and you're evaluating a proposal and you think community engagement's important, you can simply identify that as an important thing to consider before you will score the proposal. If you think performance data is important, if you think public-private partnerships are important, if you think resilience is important, adaptive capacity, environmental concerns, accessibility issues, you can simply build that into your command framework. So in that sense, it's more flexible than some of the other frameworks, ironically, as a bureaucratic model, but it has a big appetite. It can engage with a lot of these concepts. So how would this work? I just want to put this quick example up for you. I want to talk about a multi-criteria decision analysis tool, which is what we talk about in the report. So how does a multi-criteria decision analysis that would lend itself to a bureaucratic model work? So let's say you're making a decision on where to locate an office. Okay, on the left-hand side, you've got this indication of an office. I don't know if my red thing can show up. Oh, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Can't really see it. Can you see it? I can't.
It's working. Actually.
It is? Okay. Oh, yeah, right, okay. So let's say you're building an office. So that's your decision point in an office. You want to consider costs, facilities, and location. And so what you do is you identify costs, you consider capital, rents and rates, maintenance and lighting, and you'd score all of these things. And this would give you a score for costs. This thing on the right-hand side is the weight that you put on it. So this capital becomes a very important weight. Rent and rates becomes important. Maintenance is an important weight. And heating, lighting, et cetera, is important. Then you're looking at scoring facilities, so you think about space and attractiveness, and you look at the things you'd be concerned about there, like layout, area, general ambiance, noise levels, and you'd score each of those things, and you'd have a score for facilities. And then you'd also score under convenience, city center, its location, it's closest to the airport, and access by car, and then the prestige. The prestige seems to be on this scale very, very low, not so important in terms of its relationship to location. Each of those three boxes get a score, and that gives you a score for the particular office you're considering. So we applied this sort of thinking of multi-criteria decision analysis to how we would approach making critical infrastructure, cultural recreational infrastructure decisions. In the report, we identify a number of questions that you would consider when evaluating a proposal for cultural recreational infrastructure. You'd think about social resilience indicators, you'd think about environmental indicators and health indicators, and you get a social environmental indicator score. On the bottom side, you get financial indicators, economic indicators, and resilience indicators, and that will give you a score for financial and economic indicators. And then what you would do is you would, and I should say this is based on some work that's been done at the World Bank recently. This is a framework that comes from the World Bank. And then what you do is you put it on this graph. And so your social environmental score on the left-hand side, and then your financial and economic indicators are at the bottom. And then each dot represents a different proposal that has been submitted for consideration. And so what you get is in box A, these are your higher priority ones that scored very high in both social and environmental concerns and financial and economic concerns. The B category, they scored high on social and environmental concerns, but they scored less well in financial and economic. And conversely, in category C, they scored high in financial economic, but lower in social and environmental. And D didn't score particularly well in either. There are lots of trade-offs in this model, which are discussed in the paper. And I'll just point out as an example, obviously, if you look at some of these things in category B, look at this. This one scored very, very high in social and environmental, but it doesn't get funded because it didn't score quite as high as this one does on financial and economic. So these models can be a little deceiving and deceptive. There's lots of decisions that go into using this kind of framework. I'm almost out of time, so I just want to get to just some concluding thoughts on this. This kind of model, I think what's very helpful about this kind of model is it's not that the model is going to make a decision for you, but it will facilitate a lot of helpful discussions in your office and your communities about what's important. When you start to articulate what are the social considerations, environmental considerations, health considerations we need to think about before we make decisions, and how does that reconcile with financial and economic considerations? How do we hold those two things in tension and make those trade-offs? It will lead to some powerful conversations, I think, about what you value. So it helps you to clarify what the problem is, your priorities and values, and the priorities and values of others. It also gives you an audit trail. It leaves some level of transparency. It gives you some information to give back to communities if they're unsuccessful in their applications. The data is very hard to collect, and I think we found that in all jurisdictions. I think finally maybe I'll say something about a recommended governance process. Politics is a very important part of this process, but it might be that we want to separate out the evaluation that happens and the political input that might happen in deciding what the criteria is, but the decisions itself is carried out by experts in the field who are aware of community issues, let's say. And I would just conclude there by saying this is the report. It's available on the website. We've got some time for questions, and there's going to be some great, I think, additional information provided about cultural recreational infrastructure. I will point out that it's available just in time for Christmas. It fits perfectly into a stocking. And next time, don't get your dad the tie. Roll up the report, put it. He'll be grateful. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Our next speaker is Bill Greenlaw, and Bill is the Executive Director for Communities, Sport and Recreation, a division of the Nova Scotia Provincial Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage. He entered government in 2003 as Executive Director for Heritage in the Department of Tourism, Culture and Heritage, and prior to this, he was the Managing Director for the Office of External Graduate Programs here at Dalhousie University. As a public administration professional, Bill has served as President of the Institute of Public Administration Canada, President of the Canadian Museum Association, and Chair of the Virtual Museum of Canada's Editorial Board. Provincially, Bill was President of Sport Nova Scotia. He's currently Vice Chair of the Coaching Association of Canada. In April 2012, Bill was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contributions to Canada in the heritage sector. So I'll welcome Bill to come up and speak next.
Thank you. So, as people always say, it's always bizarre to hear your bio kind of being read. But what I forgot is I'm an MPA grad, so I'm most proud of that. I should put in there that I have three lovely boys, 22, 20, and 16, and been married for 25 years. So when you get to this point in your life, those are the most important things. So I just want to put it in perspective of the students who are thinking about careers. Make sure that you put yourself first. So I just say that's important. So, so I was really kind of thrilled and nervous all in the same breath to be talking about this topic, being a government official and living some of these decisions and the processes every day. And I would say that this topic has resonated throughout my professional career. When I was here at Dalhousie, we were up on this Lamarchant and whatever the corner, this Coburg, and the old church building with that ugly thing that was there, the building. And we were planning this building, and so I think it turned out well, but lots of public input, discussed it with students, discussed it with the faculty, discussed it with the admin staff, and you have the result that we have today some 18 years later. So it's kind of neat to be here and put it kind of in full circle, and then I would say that when my first day on the job in the heritage file in the province of Nova Scotia, I had to deal with an infrastructure issue, a problem or a concern, however you want to frame it. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about that later on in the presentation. So it resonates, but at the root of this is policy. So an MPA focuses on public policy, so I just want to talk a little bit about that process and the choices, because there are tough choices to make when we think about making recommendations to the decision makers on capital infrastructure projects. So what I'd like to start, and just to put it out there, that for any decision maker, the most difficult decisions are those we have to make with uncertainty. So if those of you who saw Obama a couple days ago, he said the hardest thing about being president was making decisions in uncertainty. He said, because all the easy decisions are made below you, and you have to deal with all the hard questions with uncertainty. So if that is the most troubling as a recommender to decision makers, is making sure that you have the complete information. So what Kevin has presented, I believe, will help reduce uncertainty when making public sector investments. Uncertainty and the difficult choices for me go together. What I'd like to talk about, what I like about the model that was presented, it proposes a tool that is scalable and iterative. The work we do in communities ranges from projects that are under $5,000 to multi-million-dollar projects. To have the ability to use the same process, regardless of scale, is beneficial when seeking objectivity as we compare our rationale over time and check ourselves. So if we use the same kind of technique and tool, we can go back and see how we're evaluating whether we're consistent over time. The tool also allows for its own evolution based on our learnings. and on public sector policy and on the public sector policies of the day. I also see being it extremely useful in helping those thinking about seeking public sector investments, as it allows them to frame the way that they think about their projects and about public sector expectations. So when they come and ask for funding, they have a context of things that we're looking for to be able to recommend. So if we're clear and transparent about how we're going to evaluate based upon the scale, whatever we decide the variables are, those are clear and transparent to the person seeking the funding. I also think it's important for you to know that at CCH, we do have a decision-making process and where we seek out key information so that we can provide our best advice to both those seeking government investment and to our elected decision makers. We know that early planning is vital to the success of any project, and it is the best investment we can make. What the report highlights is that there is a need to have community intelligence on infrastructure, and this needs to be included in the pre-planning. By getting the resources to do this type of work, can be challenging when municipalities and governments face immediate needs. So doing that research, doing the asset mapping is a long-term thought process, upstream investment, and a lot of municipalities or smaller units are dealing with the immediate need of the sewer breaking or the sidewalk needing to be repaired, and in thinking about long-term is more difficult for councils, I think. Building on this theme, what we see as a challenge in recommending investments is our inability to find easily accessible, reliable information on community, county, or municipality infrastructure. Whose responsibility is it to collect information? Whose responsibility is it to house it? I pose that question to you, people coming up behind. And again, that is what Kevin has presented. We can provide a clear path to ensuring that the system, through using this tool, builds in and supports upfront pre-build investments like asset mapping and life cycle planning and reviews. This will ensure that when the federal government, which has recently happened with the last government, decides to create infrastructure programs, or for that matter, any level of government, we can be ready to support communities and decision makers when there are funds available. I should also note that this would be true for existing government. This tool could be used for existing government funding programs. If the province is asked to invest, then we would have a sense of the global infrastructure needs of the province. In theory, we could place the need in the context of community requirements and layer this on with the provincial priorities. This is not an easy task. It's another tough choice when comparing community to A to community B. They, in many instances, are not comparable. So if you travel around this province, you find out that the communities are distinctly unique, and they have unique personalities, and that's the beauty of our province. And trying to weigh that against infrastructure needs and demands by communities is difficult. And somebody has to make that choice, and tools help us do that. Currently, my division has a mix of infrastructure programs. Some have regional allotments, so that means we allocate $2 million and divide it up in the 6 regions of the province, while other funding programs that I have rank projects provincially, and this is done on an annual basis. Our department is currently reviewing our grant management process and seeing which one of these which do you do regional allocation, do you do provincial allocation, how do you think about investments with these annual investment type programs that we have? So I suspect at the end of the review, the answer to that kind of question will be, it depends. Because we're going to look at the uniqueness of communities and try to weigh that, and we're going to have a protracted discussion at the executive table in my department, and we'll probably come up with, it depends, right? So not satisfactory, but that's the reality of what you face. So for those of you in the MPA, and for those of you who are my colleagues in government, and shout out to my team back there, so hopefully they're the people who do all the work every day, not me, so thank you so much for all that. So I appreciate what they do. So when I talk about the team or the input into the value of decision making, they're back there, and if you're looking for jobs, they're the people to talk to, not me. So what I've just described should obviously sound logical, it's intuitive, and what you are learning, oh my God, I've got like 45 minutes left to go. Anyway, so I think that the tool, I'll just wrap, I mean, I really love this topic, so as you can tell. But one key thing that I want to just touch upon is, so the federal government provides infrastructure programs, and there's the three big ones that have just finished their life cycle. But they have sunset clauses. So you are a policy decision maker, you are looking at the analysis of the tools, and what happens? The reality of what happens is that these great funding programs happen, they have a 4 or 5 year or whatever life cycle, but two scenarios happen. One scenario is that it creates an opportunity for people to think, oh my God, I didn't know I could get $20 million to build the new library, and maybe we should seize that opportunity. Maybe it wasn't on our list, but this is the opportunity to dream big and get that infrastructure project that will be the catalyst for our community, for social benefit, for social cohesion, lifestyle attachment, et cetera. And then you weigh that against the communities that have been diligent in having a list. They have an inventory. They know exactly what they want to invest in. Not so sexy, but they need the money. So how do you weigh those decisions? How do you know when it's an annual intake over the course of a 5-year program, 5-year grant program, that you are actually making the right strategic investment when you have to deal with a window of time on the opportunity of that investment coming across your desk? And weigh that against the 5-year life cycle if you don't have intelligence. You don't have the resources or the knowledge of what are the community priorities, so you can be more objective when these situations arise. There's lots of uncertainty that we face every day, but I think in making recommendations, but I think at the end of the day, we make the right decisions. We celebrate community, we listen to community, we do the community engagement. So that 4-quadrant model that Kevin presented as part of the analysis, we kind of, like I would say we're a mix of that. So I drifted totally off what I was going to say, but I got to page 5. I normally read quicker, but anyway, so I have 1 minute left, and I normally ignore the person giving me the time thing, but he looks a little bit bigger than I, so. But again, look, there's lots of questions. Good policy is, good policy people ask questions, they check, they challenge, they understand, and then you have to layer that into the context of the day. Because no policy is right or wrong, as long as you know what the policy is. And you have to frame your decisions in the policy context of the day and of the government. And it's not my position to judge whether there should be a gate to museums or public libraries should be free. Those are decisions that have been made, and those are choices that decision makers have made before me and will make after me. But we have to give our best advice using the direction from a policy context in order to make these decisions and make the recommendations to elected officials. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, ask my staff. And thank you.
So it sounds like Bill has more to say, so then we might be able to ask him some questions about the remaining pages of his talk when we get to the question period. So next we're going to hear from Åsa Kachan. And Åsa is the CEO and Chief Librarian for Halifax Public Libraries, where she oversees 420 staff working across the 14-branch library system. As you might know, Halifax Public Libraries recently received international acclaim with the opening of Halifax's new beautiful Central Library in 2014. Prior to her role with Halifax Public Libraries, Åsa spent 16 years in senior administrative roles with universities, most recently serving as the Assistant Vice President, Enrollment and Management, and Registrar for Dalhousie University between 2004 and 2014. During Åsa's time at Dalhousie, she undertook critical transformations to improve student experience, including revamping undergraduate scholarships and bursaries, modernizing admission and recruitment practices, and improving frontline student service. She also sits on the advisory board for the Faculty of Management here at Dalhousie. And in 2018, Åsa was appointed to the Governing Council of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC, for a 3-year term. So I welcome Åsa to speak now.
I think it's old home week for Bill and for me. So I do remember when this building opened. I remember the old one on Coburg Road as well. Okay, I'm going to take my watch off. I'm going to do my very best to stay. So I'm approaching this a little bit differently from Bill. You'll notice I have very few words, and every word I have I wrote since I arrived. But I have some pictures, and for me, you know, there's a Halifax Central Library has actually provides us with a really interesting case study on how does this work well, when does it work well. So I call it reinventing a cultural asset. Libraries are not new. This is me. I'm the little one on the left. We had just immigrated from Sweden. People who are in my age bracket, your library would have looked like that. In fact, there are still libraries that look like that. And we always had a library presence, or we had from the 50s in downtown Halifax. So this building still remains a memorial library. It was built in the 1950s, but it was an homage to a time that had passed. And so almost from the day it opened, it didn't necessarily, it wasn't a cultural asset that could modernize. I think part of what Kevin said was, you know, we build them well, and then, but how do we build them for longevity? Because they don't come and go very quickly. And in fact, there were many, many conversations in Halifax. My predecessor, Judith Hare, worked tirelessly for 17 years before we had a new central library, and it was her top priority when she arrived on the job. The process of getting there is really an interesting case study. So this is a public asset. It belongs to the community. But then how do you ask the community the right questions to inform the right outcome? And you know, I didn't arrive till 6 weeks before opening, so this is not me tooting my own horn. This is me acknowledging the people who came before me. The most remarkable thing about the public engagement, and we've woven it into how we operate on an ongoing basis, is we didn't ask people, what do you want from your library? Because they would have said, oh, I'd like a few more DVDs. You know, I really like those graphic novels. Can you keep buying those? And that's actually, that might be helpful in the short term, but it's not going to help us build a future-proof building. So what we really needed to hear was, what have people learned in their life? What do they aspire to? And what was really interesting was the themes that came out of that public consultation. You don't see book listed here. You don't see video listed here. What you actually have is that aspiration for the kind of community that we want to be. And if we can take our public assets and achieve that aspirational state, and we're at a really interesting point to analyze this because we're celebrating our 5th anniversary coming up in mid-December. These were the hopes that the community expressed in the process. And then we found a great corner in downtown, and you know, this all seems very quick, but it wasn't. We dug and we built, and you know, there was money that came from a whole variety of sources. So you know, both. You know, Kevin talked about being ready for the programs, or Bill talked about being ready for the programs, because this had been a work in progress for so long. We were pretty shovel ready. Our proposal was pretty ready to go. And when the federal government announced federal infrastructure funding to put Atlantic Canadians back to work, we had a library for them. And the province was prepared to step up, and the municipality was prepared to step up. There had been some land sold and swapped. We had a little shortfall, and for the first time in the library's history, we dove headfirst into private sector and personal donations to try to bridge that gap. So opening day arrived, we handed out 400 pairs of safety scissors and said, cut the ribbon to your library. There was a lot of expectation. What this picture doesn't show was the people who were saying, why are we spending money on a library in the age of Google? And then they came through the door, and just look at those faces. Right? That was the awe of the building, but then we had also the responsibility to translate the aspiration into how we operated. I put this up because I talk about it begins with giving the public ownership. It's such a basic concept. The public's money paid for it, and yet many, many of our public assets, and I challenge you to walk as far as you can into public buildings and see where you get stopped. Right? You're not going to get too far into the police station. You're not going to get too far into the courthouse. You're not going to get, you know, there'll be a commissioner who'll stop you at many of the public assets that belong to us. But our objective was to give the public ownership of the public library. So that required us to say, whatever happens here is actually about the aspiration, and it's about what the public wants. So there's noise, there's food, we built it to handle it, there's dancing. And you know, we're not trying to become a recreation facility, but what we discovered was people might try dance in a library who would never walk into a recreation center. And so where is that point of intersection where we can introduce people to theater or dance, or they can be exposed to music, whether they can afford a ticket to a concert or not. Art factors in, dogs, drag queen story time, which some people consider controversial. We just think is a really great time, really fun. Even gaming, which wouldn't have traditionally been viewed as a cultural activity, ends up actually being an act of inclusivity. So in my childhood, I remember asking for a Nancy Drew book and being told that that wasn't actually the kind of literature the library had. What things like gaming do is they actually invite people in who have a low level of English proficiency. You know, FIFA soccer online is pretty similar around the world. Or it is people who may not be drawn to literature and how we engage them in this public space in an equitable way. So changing of the world, the idea of being quiet, the idea of being noisy. You'll see people have their feet tucked up. They have coffee cups. The photo on the right-hand side really, and what this space has is actually a lot of flexibility. So go in there someday and pretend the furniture is all gone and the shelving is all gone, and we don't know, we can predict what kind of future experience people might want in this public space in 20 years, but we believe that the openness invites a high degree of flexibility. It also becomes then the launch point for exposure to things that people may also have a restricted access to. So we love that we have rotating art exhibits. We love that we have music studios. Seniors record family histories. We have emerging musicians. We have jamming on Friday afternoons. We have newcomer cooking programs. This has come, you have the asset and you can leverage the funding for programs. So intergenerational learning around food literacy. Food insecurity is one of the things that our community identified. They never would have thought the library had a role in resolving that, but in fact it dovetails very nicely into the work that we do. Learning and sharing knowledge takes very different forms. I want to say, though, this isn't just a free-for-all, have fun today, although we have a lot of fun at the library. It actually, there is an entire strategy and a framework behind it, and some of it's a library strategic plan, so we look internally to where we set our direction. We have service models. We talk about, what are the themes within, how do we support independence and build community and personalize for people who need our additional help. There's a culture action plan that directs the work that we do with respect to culture. The Now or Never, with the One Nova Scotia plan, which came out, Ray Ivany penned it, it must be six years ago, probably by now. He talked about how we create a better economic future for Nova Scotia. There wasn't a single mention of libraries, and yet this has become one of our guiding documents. So the lesson is not to actually wait to be mentioned, but to say, well, actually, if it is about students emerging off campus or stepping off campus and building community, we can make that happen at the public library, and we've been voted the best student hang for 5 years. It's about newcomers having a soft place to land. How do we age well? Certainly our touch points are municipal and they're provincial. Very quickly, I want to touch on a couple of things that Kevin said around the infrastructure governance. We actually approach some aspects of the private sector in the public sector, so we look at analytics. We analyze who's coming and who's not coming, who are we not reaching. Things like supply chain management, for us that means how do we move that book faster so it can be used more time, so it can impact more people. What is the retail expectation? If on Amazon they say, oh, well, the person who looked at this coffee maker also looked at these other two, why are we not recommending books online when somebody places a hold on something that's not immediately available to them? Things we will learn. I also think we are entirely driven by societal issues, people's relationship to their homes and communities. Lots of interesting studies on issues related to people's how comfortable they feel in their own homes, what kinds of things they seek in a technological age, where's our role as public institutions in civil discourse, and so much of what consumes us today are social determinants of health. So our libraries are working actually to reduce healthcare costs in the future by reducing isolation, by improving food knowledge, by providing opportunity and literacy, response to stress. Lots of conversations happen that need to happen in our community, and we need to rely on our public spaces to provide that. Reconciliation needs to be modeled in our public institutions. Newcomers need a place to land. This is critical economically, but also socially. Technology, families, food, and food learning. We need to be entirely inclusive in how we do our work if we're going to achieve the social outcome. Everything from autism toolkits. Radon detectors, we distribute those through our public libraries. We loan them. People don't need a radon detector more than once. we have a sharing infrastructure that we might as well leverage in the interest of reducing lung cancer. People tend not to think so much about libraries in the fight against lung cancer, but we can play a really easy role. So it is about how we move forward and find one another in our public institutions, how we are ready from a governance perspective to continue to respond to the issues that come forward. So that was 10 seconds long. Woo!
Thank you, Åsa. Next, we will hear from Gil Dares. And Gil has been instrumental in the development of recreational facilities in Yarmouth for many years. Whether as a volunteer spearheading a major project, a member of the governance body, or in his capacity on contract as the general manager of the Mariners Center for more than a decade, he's provided leadership and motivation. His dedication to his community has earned him recognition at the local, provincial, national, and international levels. In addition to his service on numerous committees, he served as the longtime chairperson of a number of organizations and agencies. His interests are varied, but always his commitment is to making his community a better place to live, work, and play. His volunteer service on regional and provincial committees includes Recreation Nova Scotia and the Nova Scotia Sports Hall of Fame. Gil offers perspectives on the importance of cultural and recreational facilities in rural Nova Scotia and the path to success in their development from conception to completion. So I'll welcome Gil to come up now.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here today to offer a perspective on the challenges that are facing rural Nova Scotia in regards to recreational and cultural infrastructure. I grew up here in Metro, and as a young teen, I had all kinds of opportunities available to me to participate in recreation activities. I paddled a war canoe at Lake Banook, I took scuba diving at the YMCA, and I played football in minor leagues and at the high school level. And one of my favorite memories, of course, is winning a high school provincial championship at a university field just down the road from here. At the time, I took those opportunities for granted. The facilities existed here in Metro that enabled me to participate in whatever activity I actually chose to participate in. But in 19, I left Nova Scotia to pursue a career, and since then, I've lived and worked almost exclusively in small towns in Canada. It was my introduction to the rural environment that opened my eyes to the fact that these opportunities are not universal. Since 1984, I've lived in Yarmouth, southwest Nova Scotia. It's a relatively small community, but it is a commercial and regional hub for activity throughout the southwest Nova. When I arrived there, Yarmouth was serviced by daily flights to St. John, Boston, and Halifax. There were 2 bus services to Halifax daily. There were 2 trains that arrived morning and evening. There were 2 international ferries, one seasonal and one year-round, that connected us 7 days a week to Maine. And the population was stable, and employment opportunities were abundant. But even then, what was sadly lacking was recreation infrastructure. Small towns have a notion that it's beyond reach because of financial reasons. So as a coach in youth sports, I was frustrated by the fact that we didn't have a lighted ball complex. And so that was the first project that I initiated. And it took us about 3 years to raise the funds and to do the hands-on labor to build a lighted ball complex. And what this did, it enabled us to apply for national and provincial tournaments. It was one of the criteria. On the very first weekend that tournament, the ball field was, the lights were turned on, there was a national tournament. The economic activity generated from that one event provided clear evidence of the value of sport tourism to a small community. And the importance of this is that it also set an example for the next phase of recreation infrastructure. The only skating rink in Yarmouth was a wooden agricultural barn, had been extended back in the 1950s and equipped with an ice plant. It had no insulation, it had no air handling equipment, and the ceilings were 12 feet high. It was fraught with problems. In fact, there were times that the ice season was short, and there were times that games had to be canceled because of fog. And I don't mean fog outside, I mean fog inside. Capitalizing on the success of the Baseball Yarmouth group, we formed Skate Yarmouth in 1995. And over the next 7 years, we worked tirelessly to build the first of its kind in Nova Scotia, the first of the genre of multi-purpose facilities in small communities. So the first step was to identify and bring together all the partners. And we did that, and that was interesting because the 3 municipal units had never shared in an infrastructure project up to that time. What was being proposed, of course, was a project of a magnitude that had never been undertaken in the area. And one of the other keys, and I think the others have mentioned it, is public engagement. That's key to success. The next order of business was to complete a needs assessment. So we worked on that for some time. This document clearly identified the parameters of the initial build. It involved significant public consultation, engagement with target groups, and to support the findings of the needs assessment, we then did what we called a benefits document. And the benefits document actually offered the rationale for the project. And the third and final piece of the puzzle was to come up with the costing, both capital and operating. Following a recommendation from a COA, actually, our budgetary submission was analyzed, and they concluded that the assumptions of a volunteer group, the assumptions that our findings were reasonable. So all this information gets presented to the 3 levels of government along with an executive summary. Over the next few years, the process was interrupted by 2 federal elections, 2 provincial elections, and 2 municipal elections. At one point, the Premier of Nova Scotia, I recall, came to Yarmouth at the 11th hour, anticipating a non-confidence vote on the budget, came to Yarmouth the day before that to announce the provincial funding so that it wouldn't be lost. So bully for him. The Mariner Centre, as I mentioned, became the first of a number of these facilities across the province. And we had developed the process to secure the funding. So now we had a COA referring other groups and other communities to us to say, okay, you guys did it. How did you do it? What's the path that we need to follow? But the need for improved infrastructure remains. The only community pool in Yarmouth right now was built in 1967. It's a 20-yard pool, so it can't be used for competition swimming. This past Friday, I attended the induction ceremony for the Sports Hall of Fame here in Halifax. Jody Shelley, who played 14 years in the NHL and was still a fan favorite of the Mooseheads in Halifax here, was inducted. He was one of the people inducted, and his formative years in minor hockey were in a foggy barn. Likewise, there was another member from Yarmouth in attendance at that evening, and that's Ginny Smith, who was a swimming coach for 47 years in a community that didn't have a competition-sized pool. And so both of these people are shining examples in my mind of what could be accomplished, but more so what provides hope for what could be possible if you had modern recreation facilities. In 2013, there was a motion by one of the owners, the Mariner Centre is co-owned, and there was a motion by one of the owners to explore a long-term strategic plan for the property. And some of the things that were included to take into consideration were uses such as an aquatic center, curling rink, and a field house. Given that instruction, and there's people in this room today that sat in the room with me, but given that instruction, a meeting of stakeholders was convened to determine a course of action. Funding was granted by the municipal partners in the province of Nova Scotia, and a consultant was selected. Because of the procurement policies of the province, of course, selecting a consultant isn't something you just don't pick his name out of the yellow pages. So that complicates the process a little. Once chosen, the consultant spent the next several months holding public participation meetings, circulating questionnaires, and conducting interviews with special interest groups. The needs assessment outlined the possibilities that would meet the needs of the community. In particular, the failing infrastructure of both the YMCA and the local curling club were considered. The draft copy and the final version of this document were circulated to the councils. The next logical step was to conduct a feasibility study. And once again, funding was approved from the same sources. The process was repeated, a consultant was engaged, and once again, the draft and final versions of this document were circulated. At this point, there was significant enthusiasm and support from the public for proceeding with the project. However, the owners elected to go a different route, and the process was stymied. So in essence, what I'm saying is that the process, in my mind, hasn't changed in decades. Many years ago, I had the privilege of presenting at a provincial initiative of Sport and Rec Nova Scotia, building healthy communities together. It provided a forum for communicating the importance of recreational activities in our lives. I think it's necessary to highlight why this is so important in a community like Yarmouth. Southwest Nova has the highest rates of obesity in the province of Nova Scotia. It also has the highest rates of chronic illness and the highest rates of persons with more than one medical condition. So we're all aware of the doctor shortage and the healthcare crisis. We know that participation in recreation activity reduces both the incidence and severity of illness and disability. So it's logical to invest in recreation to reduce the strain on health services. Providing employees with access to recreation provides direct and measurable benefits to employers. That it shows increases in productivity, reduction of absenteeism, and that translates into a better bottom line, and employers know this. The most common question asked of real estate agents by potential investors and new residents is the availability of recreation services. There are ample studies on youth crime to support the assertion that those youth exposed to and participate in recreation are far less likely to be engaged in antisocial behavior. It's no coincidence. It teaches life skills, fair play, teamwork, mutual respect. Those who are advocating for stricter penalties should consider the increased cost of incarceration, insurance, policing and court costs, and the public cost of vandalism. And I've mentioned sports tourism and the value of that, especially in a small town. The demographics of Yarmouth County indicate an aging population. Seniors especially need a safe and friendly environment to engage in healthy activities, a place to socialize, and a place to enjoy a better quality of life. And then there's simply pride of place. Yarmouth's not unique. Other communities and small towns in Nova Scotia experience similar circumstances. What is missing, in my opinion, is a uniform method of determining where these facilities are needed and how infrastructure dollars should be allotted. With communities competing for funding from the senior levels of government, the assessment tool must include priority ratings based on need. There's often a wide gap between wants and needs. Needs deserve the attention of funding agencies. Wants should be determined on the ability of the community to be self-sustaining. A province-wide assessment of recreation infrastructure, including all of the variables, could provide a framework for the future of recreation in Nova Scotia, and that would make us all winners. Thank you.
So at this point, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and it's a time where we're able to have some open discussion on these topics. And I think we'll start with a question that comes from one of the student who's prepared a question based on this pre-reading and these talks. So Eric, go ahead.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Eric Bowdridge, a Master's of Public Administration student here at Dalhousie University. I appreciate that you all came out to discuss current research on the topic today. I have a question for Mr. Greenlaw. Experts suggest that asset recycling, the selling of public capital assets to private industry to reinvest in new government infrastructure, would help improve long-term social service and economic needs. Why has Nova Scotia not adapted asset recycling into initiatives like the sports and recreation funding programs? Thank you.
I have to really answer that? Oh, I'm getting close to retirement, so I can take a kick at this one. Teasing. So, well, it depends on the perspective. So, if you view that Halifax is all-knowing and all like the great wizard, you go in and you see this great head and they tell you what to do to be successful. That's one view, so that would be your command from Halifax kind of model. And then you have to look at where are the communities at. So is the community prepared to take on that approach? So I don't necessarily, personally, I've never, since being in government, think that Halifax has, to say, when you go to the regions, it's Halifax, right? So I don't think that Halifax has the answers. I think the answers lay in community. And you need to engage community, and that's why we have, in my department, people in the regions who are engaging community on a daily level basis to find out what their needs are, what the priorities are, and have those discussions about asset recycling or that to embed it in a way of thinking and to help educate. Because, We build new rinks on the hope that, or communities do, like look at Halifax, like they have not been able, like getting rinks closed is almost impossible with the new pads. So why does that happen? So part of it is education. Part of it is, are we using those assets properly, that people think that there's a need for them? When you talk to staff at HRM, they say that the multitude of clubs competing for the prime time is not efficient. If you had one club, you could probably utilize and meet everybody's demand in Metro for the access to that ice time or that pool time or the court time or whatever it may be. So to me, it lays with community. It's not a provincial decision. We can set the tools and the policies in place, and we can respond to public requests for funding and for guidance, but really the decision should lay in the community.
Thanks for your response. I see a question here.
Hello. I understand that the federal money is tied to environmental impact studies for cultural and recreation. I'm wondering what Nova Scotia's policy is, and HRM or whatever. When you have a joint project with federal, provincial, and municipal, I imagine that the federal environmental impact study is shared with everybody, but I don't know about Nova Scotia and the HRM.
Yeah, I don't actually. I'd have to. Dawn, you've done the I have not filled out the federal application, so I'm not sure. So we don't require it.
So we'll repeat that for the mic, just because we're mic'd here, so we don't, you don't do the.
We don't require it as part of our portion of the investment.
Because Bill, this is being broadcast around the world.
Yes. Oh, it's a fact. I'm okay.
Okay, I see another question just at the back
I
here.
have a question for Åsa. I'm just curious about what are some of the challenges you face connecting so many different sort of communities in one community space, as not necessarily communities, but
Sorry, I'll need you to speak up
yeah,
just a little
sorry.
bit.
I'm just curious, like, what are the challenges when it comes to connecting so many moving parts of the community in one space, and how do you make sure that every individual is kind of represented in that sort of area?
Yeah, I think you raise it's a dance, right? It's an ongoing challenge. I think we are helped by the fact that Central Library is one of 14 libraries that we have within our system, and we are helped by the fact that we have a great built environment. So we can actually accommodate a whole number of things within a common space because of the built environment. But it is a dance. I would say that and it's actually even a conflict within individuals. They might come one day and they want to be part of a group conversation with food and noise and laughter, and then the next day they're seeking solace and they're seeking quiet, and we're trying to accommodate all those disparate needs. I think we certainly are very committed and put a lens of inclusivity around what we do. The Accessibility Secretariat has just come out with guidelines, and libraries are in the early will be among the early adopters of those standards. And people often think about accessibility with respect to built environment. In fact, accessibility has a lot to do with accessibility of programs and full participation in society. So it's a much broader lens. So it is a dance, but I think mostly we get it right, and it has to do a lot with listening. That concept of public ownership is actually how do we share this space well with our community, and loosen our grip on it in a sense. So think of it as a cultural revolution. There was a time, and again, I'm appealing to the people of my generation or older, where the libraries were like the liquor stores. You filled out a slip of paper and somebody went in the back room and got, the Paradise Lost or a bottle of rum, or, No, you didn't get the bottle of rum at the library, but the same concept. You would get the one item you had requested, and then there was a shift toward browsability. I think now it is much beyond that, and it's everything from ability to move furniture to make it work, and that has helped a great deal. I mean, the most common complaint we get is people want us open more hours, and we're open 12 hours a day most days. I mean, one of the things I didn't mention was sort of the high degree of public engagement. So the old library, which I pictured, had 390,000 visits per year. The new one was built anticipating 900,000, and we had just shy of 2 million in the first year, and we have settled in at about 1.6 million. So that is 6,000 people a day whose lives are enriched by sometimes just being in the space and sometimes full participation in programs or not.
Thanks. There's a question just coming from over here now.
Hi, my name is Sebastian LaBelle. I'm the Executive Director of the Bus Stop Theatre Cooperative, which operates the Bus Stop Theatre in North End Halifax. My question is a general question, perhaps for responses to anyone, and perhaps even the event organizers. But my question is, why in the context of a discussion about valuing cultural and recreational infrastructure investments, is the consideration of arts infrastructure an afterthought or kind of in the margins? Especially in the context of a province which includes in Halifax the largest arts and culture center north of Boston and east of Montreal, and also where the arts sector is an increasingly acute crisis for lack of investment in infrastructure. And I say that because to me that's demonstrated by the fact that there's no one in this esteemed panel that represents the arts sector. And in the event description, there's a list of facilities to demonstrate what are cultural and recreational infrastructure examples, and these are all recreational facilities with the exception of something called a music hall, which is terminology from the vaudeville era. And so those are kind of examples of why even in the context of this discussion, the arts sector is made to feel as an afterthought or something not valued.
I'll first go. I don't have a heck of a lot to add to your question, only to say that there is some data in the report around the value of the arts culture to the Nova Scotia economy and its value in communities. So there is some reference to it. It's just, unfortunately, didn't have enough time to go through all the details of the report. I think, in fact, ironically, given the way you framed this, if you were thinking it strictly through an economic lens, the arguments would be that the arts and culture sector provide more to the economy than the sports sector does, in fact. But anyway, I just point out that irony.
No, that's fine.
Well, I am from Communities, Culture and Heritage, so my colleague Marcel McCoe has retired, and Marcel was originally involved in this discussion, so my background is specifically with some history with the museum, so I can speak to museum infrastructure and the choices and the trade-offs, but I very much, and the department acknowledges the importance of cultural infrastructure investments, so if I hadn't stopped on page 4, I might have been able to get to that, but but point well taken. Thank you.
I would like to comment just briefly in that it's an unfortunate set of circumstances in the community I'm in that we ended up with the recreation component and the arts and culture component actually being conflicting, and it became quite divisive in the community, and instead of trying to weigh the importance of each, it became them against us. And it's very unfortunate when that happens, and that was the results of the problem was public engagement. And I don't think in one case there was enough public engagement or public support at the outset. And then it became a lightning rod for dissent. So, unfortunate.
There was just another question here. Okay, and then we'll come forward to.
I'm a taxpayer living in Halifax with a foot in rural Nova Scotia. In Liverpool, there is a lovely new recreational facility which has a rink and a gymnasium area, a walking track. It's very limited, and it is struggling to stay operating because of it's rather limited in what it can offer the community. I admire tremendously the programming that happens at the Halifax Library and see how flexible you have made that space and how you incorporate everything from arts and cultural activities to physical activity. And I wonder if going forward, the provincial government will look more at what you have done in programming when they're developing facilities in rural Nova Scotia.
Well, I guess I would just, I mean, actually I have a place down by Liverpool, so I know Queen's Place very well, and or East Port LeBaron specifically. So, again, I think that like the community consultations need to pick that up. So the community needs to have a voice in what they want with regards to the infrastructure. So we receive a proposal to invest in a certain area, but we respond to what the community is asking for. So the community needs to have a voice. Your voice is extremely important. And like my children, or like the 20-somethings, are very articulate in what they want and very clear on social policy and social benefits, of et cetera. So to me, like that needs to come from the community. It's that we can look at parameters and the success and the numbers and give our best advice to community, but that needs to come from community. So, and I would say that was picked up in the public consultations and engagement with the needs and wants of the public library.
So although my slides focused on Central as a case study, we actually have a number of examples where we have had good integration between recreation services and library services in a way that makes sense for the community. And Musquodoboit Harbor is, if you've had a chance to go out there, is the library and recreation center are just before you turn right to head to Martinique Beach. So I encourage, if you're there, stop in and have a look at that. That's an interesting, it's a really, we talk about reinventing assets. Mm-hmm. It's a strip mall that at some point was purchased, and there was a library that sat where one store might have been, and there was a recreation facility that sat next to it. Snow blew in under the doors. It was, you know, sadly, and we have fixed this, but it was a bit of the home of the lost mismatched shelving on the library side. So imagine that. But we did an interesting thing by just simply taking down the wall. We took 5 inaccessible washrooms and made 3 fully accessible washrooms. We now have a common lobby, and what's been really interesting to see in that collaboration is there's a gym, and the people who come to use the gym are now walking through a community kitchen that has food learning happening. They're adjacent to the public library. We can leave our holds, after the library closes, our holds are in the lobby. We have a self-checkout machine. Somebody who's commuting to Musquodoboit Harbor and arrives home at 8:30 or 9 p.m., just go in and pick up their book and check it out themselves. And we have a community printer and community Wi-Fi access. And there are I actually think some of our best opportunities are on the small scale in the small community, where we can really look at the outcomes we're trying to achieve and work to solve some of our infrastructure issues, but in a way that has good impact. What's been interesting for us is our library usage has gone up about 158%. Our Wi-Fi usage has more than doubled. We know that there are people who never use the library who now use it, and people who never dared tiptoe into the recreation center who now actually feel a little bit braver because, they might take a yoga class while their child has story time, and it all works smoothly together. So I think it does not always need to be enormous. It can actually work quite well with good expertise, a lot of listening to the community and responding to their interests. Because we adjusted hours according to what the community wanted as well. So it's a nice success story. So, stop by Musquodoboit Harbor.
Thank you. We have time for for one more question, if there's another question up there. Oh, okay.
Hi, I've been given
Follow-up
the mic already.
question.
Hi, so I'm coming from a particular place where I happen to be an elected official right now, but my career is professional artist. And I have toured across the country and in many international locations and been in a variety, and when I say variety, I really mean that, very differing kind of cultural spaces to do performances. So I have kind of a wish list of what I would love to see here, but I also love what I'm hearing about community, and just a quick shout out to the Dartmouth North Library, which has now been transformed with a glass wall, which is still a tiny little library.
And sliding doors.
That's right, sorry, a glass sliding door that opens out onto a beautiful patio and an amazing play structure for kids. So all of a sudden this space that was probably underused and with a terrible playground is now kind of a place where parents can sit on the patio and watch their kids and play in a really challenging environment, which I totally love, but that's not what I want to say. So my question comes from the professional artist, grant writer, person who's looking for for money to, for cultural space. And when I was listening to you, Dr. Quigley, about the model, the recommended model that the province will now be using, or presumably, or at least take under consideration, I'm not sure what the plan is. My concern when you were talking, basically it gives me the shivers as a professional artist to think that my grant application or my proposal is going to get plotted on a graph, right. And if it doesn't, fit into that one quadrant, then probably not going to get funded. And so my question is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the recommendations to the province and the policymakers and the decision makers about what is the other information then that you seek or that you investigate, especially, as I'm saying, given the emphasis on the need to know exactly what the community is and what it needs. So how does that research progress or continue so that the right decisions are being made?
Right, okay. So thank you for your question. It's a great question. I'll just reveal that my first degree was in English literature, and I weep also sometimes when I look at graphs and think that all of these things can be done in this sort of rational format, because I would reject that idea anyway, and so I'm with you on that. And I also spend a lot of my time writing grants, and I'm greatly concerned that they're plotted on graphs and they don't necessarily do justice to the work that we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it does come from a sort of rational approach to decision making. It's working within a bureaucratic context where that is probably it's most conducive to that kind of decision making. But I do think, and I should also say that I won't speak for Bill, but this is a thought piece that we have written. This is not, there's no assumption that the province or federal government has accepted this. This is just something, we did a lot of research. We said, this looks like a model you could use. You should think about it. I would say, I would summarize it that way. When I think about SSHRC grants, though, for example, that I compete for often, there are criteria, and you submit them, and experts review them. People in your field review them, and they try to understand what you're saying, and then they evaluate them. So I think one of the parts is, who's doing the evaluation. That's one aspect of it. How close are they to community concerns? So you could have, expert opinions, but you could also have people based in the community who are doing those evaluations. I think, though, most importantly, what I would say is that one of the things that I found interesting in the process of writing the paper was when you put a model like that in front of everybody to kick around, people talk about a lot of stuff. They talk about what they value and what they don't, and the concerns come up. And so in that sense, it kind of gives you a sort of fence or parameters in which to work, and then people start talking about, well, what do we value? And if we're able to put a proposal together. If we're going to reject a proposal, and I think this is part of the issue too. If we're going to say no, on what basis are we going to say no? What kind of feedback are we going to give to the person so they can go away and improve it and then resubmit it, instead of just saying, well, anyway, trying to establish some sort of criteria and basis upon which to act and have a conversation. One of the things about the sort of 2x2 matrix from the World Bank, as well as that I have my little A box in the top right-hand corner saying this is what you would fund. But I pointed out, in fact, there are other dots that did very, very well in social environmental. So one of the things I made clear in the paper is that you can also, move that budget line around. You could say, let's put more emphasis on social environmental and less emphasis on financial economic. It might be there are certain communities where you feel like the concerns around health, for example, as Gil pointed out, there's some areas where the health concerns are very, very significant. And cultural recreational infrastructure can make a big difference in the lives of those communities, but they may not have the operating budget, the revenue streams to support the infrastructure. So you want to kind of create a framework that can allow you to have those discussions, provide feedback to the communities who are making those applications, and also move your budget lines around to represent what you consider important. It's never going to be perfect. Those bureaucratic models are never going to be perfect, but I do believe they allow you to be more explicit about what you value, what you don't, what feedback you want to give, and hopefully it will facilitate those kind of conversations and create a little more transparency about what you're valuing, how you're making decisions, and the feedback you're providing. Imperfect, but it's something. Absent that, then I'm not sure where you go from there, right? Because how do we pick other programs? How do we say we're going to fund this music hall, but not that, library? Like, how do we make those the trade-offs? This is the thing. We can bring attention to a lot of these issues and say, these are really important issues. We need to fund more community centers, more gyms. We can do all that, but at the end of the day, we also have to make decisions about what are we going to fund, how big are we going to fund it? Is it going to be a fabulous community center with an NBA court and an NHL type rink, or is it going to be something smaller? And then who's going to pay for it on the other side in terms of the operating costs? So the list of questions is very, very long, and so there's an appendix in the report that says, for all of those boxes that I put down, social, environmental, health, resilience, et cetera, drawing from a number of reports that we looked at, we have a long list of questions where we've suggested these are the kinds of questions you might want to ask. But at the end of the day, if you own that document, they're going to have to be your questions that represent your values. This is just a kind of proposition that we were offering based on the research that we've done.
I
Thank you
think
for the question. Good question. Yeah.
we'll kind of consider those our last words of wisdom from the panel. And it was really a pleasure to chair the panel today. And I want to invite Kevin up now to just offer some final remarks on the Policy Matters series.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Karen, for doing such a great job on the chair. I just want to take a couple minutes to thank everybody because this is our last panel today. We've had 10 panels in Policy Matters this year. This was our 3rd season, so probably about our 30th panel, I suppose, that we've had since we started the series. This year, we welcomed 47 speakers to Policy Matters. We received over 1,000 people in this room over the 10 weeks. We had 3,500 unique viewers on social media during the time of the series. It's been our largest series by far on all of these metrics. And however imperfect these metrics can be, nevertheless, it does tell us something about there being an audience. Maybe they didn't like what they were seeing, but in any event, we did capture the metrics. I'm always mindful of the limitations of these metrics, right? But nevertheless, we capture them. We were very pleased with the response that we got. It was very helpful to have a federal election, a preset federal election date, so we could plan important federal policy topics to discuss in advance of the election. But nevertheless, it was great to get such a positive response from the community and from the media as well. We were picked up by the media quite a bit. I think we had about 12 media interviews during the time of the speaker series. It's actually quite a large group of people that help this come together every single week, and I want to just take a moment to thank Tarya Jadi, Caitlin Lowe, Julian, who's from Firefly Media, and he's recording and broadcasting us every week. Thank you, Julian. Spencer from Dalhousie's AV shop sets all the technology up for us. Daryl Dexter, who unfortunately was unable to be here today because he's attending a funeral in Cape Breton, but I do want to shout out for Daryl Dexter, who's been a partner in this speaker series since day one 3 years ago. So thank you to Daryl Dexter. I would like to thank Warren McDougall, who does all the communications public relations for us. And Jocelyn Wankin, who does the project coordination for the event. So thank you, Jocelyn. Final thank you to the audience who spend all the time coming here and attending, and the MPA students who've shared the space with you for this opportunity, these great public policy discussions. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll be back next year and we'll do it all again. So thank you.